The future of news is pretty murky right now. It's pretty clear that AI is going to affect content generation quite a bit. It is essentially going to make writing free, and that puts into question what a journalist is. It's quite possible that a journalist has to turn into a PI that doesn't do their own writing because the writing can be done faster and much cheaper by an AI model and not by the journalist. If that happens, we're going to see a lot more content being generated. And then the question is, how do we figure out what is good content? And how do we make sure that what people mostly consume is the good stuff and not everything else? And I'm hoping that we will figure out a system to do that, but it's more difficult. You can think of this as when spam was invented and people started sending us automated emails. Thankfully, we figured out a way to filter some of them out and to make sure that at least most of what reaches our main inbox already has the spam filtered out. But it's not that clear that we can do the same thing with news, because it's much easier for people to make things that look like news. At least with spam, we can filter by commercial intent. If they're offering us to buy something that is typically associated with spam, like fake pharmaceuticals or crypto or something like that, spam filters can just remove that based on what the offer is. But if the offer is, this event happened, how do we tell the difference between the real event or the fake event or the real event described in a low quality way? So that's a much harder problem. That's the problem that my main company, OtherWeb, is trying to fix, to essentially come up with good ways to filter content, good ways to select the good content that actually informs people about stuff that happened. But it's certainly not a solved problem, and it's going to be an arms race with the bad guys trying to create a lot of bad content and the good guys trying to find better and better ways to filter it out. The news media market is shrinking primarily because there is an abundance of content out there. We are getting more and more people who aren't a part of traditional news media producing more and more content. Now, the demand for content remained the same. There's roughly as many people. The population is growing fairly slowly. In fact, the number of people who actually consume news specifically is decreasing because the news seems to be going down in quality from people's perception. And so you have more supply of content chasing less demand. That means the people who are creating content are making less and less money. And so when you look at the dollar sizes of these markets, it seems like they're shrinking all the time. And the reaction from people in those markets seems to be, let's find a better way to monetize things, right? They say advertising is problematic. It's because people use ad blockers. Let's fight the ad blockers. Maybe it will fix the problem. Or maybe they blame Facebook and Google for not sending enough people and for monetizing the content in their own way. I think all of that is somewhat misplaced, because the problem is not how news content is monetized. The problem is that if there is more content out there, then this particular type of content is worth less. Doesn't mean it's worthless, but it is worth less than before, and the industry just needs to adjust to that. They have to realize there is no method to fix this using some tweaks in monetization. They have to understand the product they are creating is no longer that unique. It has more competition, and the competition is free. And when that happens in any market, then you have to charge less for the same product. Yeah, people going to TikTok for the news is an odd phenomenon, because I think those same people, if you ask them, do you consume news, will actually say no. And they just don't perceive TikTok as news, but they go there for the news. I also have a lot of friends that go to Twitter for the news. And Twitter is really good at reporting on things quickly. Things really appear on Twitter before they appear anywhere else. It's really bad at selecting the true things to report on and not everything else. So for every real fact that you learn on Twitter, you're going to consume 10 facts that aren't real, and there's really no way to tell the difference. But certainly that's an example of content competing with news content. It looks the same. People can't quite tell the difference. It's actually more convenient to consume it on TikTok or on Twitter. And so if more and more people switch to consuming content that way, then clearly news has less eyeballs to monetize. So the news market is going to shrink, and the content that they produce has more competition, so it's worth less dollars to them. Creating an AI that detects AI written content is an unsolvable problem. It's not just unsolved, it's impossible to solve in the general sense. Because the way we train AI models to write is by letting them ingest a lot of things that people have generated and teaching them how to predict the most likely next word in human-generated text, essentially. That is what an LLM does. It just guesses the most likely next word. So if an AI is trained well to do that, what it produces is, by definition, the most likely thing for a human to write. There's no general way to detect that and to say AI did this and not a human. What all the detection engines today are doing instead is they're learning specific quirks of specific AI models, and then they're able to detect those quirks. So you can detect ChatGPT generated text. You can detect Claude generated text. You can detect base llama generated text. But that doesn't mean that you can detect AI generated text. If I take any of these base models and I do even slight fine-tuning with my own datasets, the way it starts writing now tricks all of these detection engines, and they are no longer able to detect it. User-generated content is really an interesting phenomenon because it's not quite clear whether it's better or worse. It's sometimes both. So it's clearly worse in the sense that users don't have the same standards that journalists do. So they don't double source things, they don't verify things before publication, they don't even know what journalistic ethics are, so you can't fault them for not following them. On the other hand, it looks like we learn to trust specific personalities more than others. And so to the extent that users have earned our trust, maybe they do something better than the previous ecosystem. So maybe there are some particular topics that traditional news media weren't covering before because they didn't fit the narrative, right? Or because they weren't monetizable enough, not enough people are interested in this. User-generated content can close that gap by reporting things that were underreported before, maybe reporting things that are only relevant to a small group of people that a traditional news publisher would not actually appeal to. And so that in itself is great. The problem is, again, we have a revolution in how we distribute content. It's gotten democratized. Anybody can now create content, put it on the internet, and have millions of people watch it. But people haven't quite adjusted to it. People still have this built-in assumption that if it's printed in something that looks like a newspaper, it must be true. And one of the results is my parents keep forwarding me articles and I have to tell them, no, this did not happen. No, the actual link you sent is to a newspaper that isn't a real newspaper. I can see the website was created last week, right? And you have all of these things just because every time you have a revolution in the way content is created, it takes the public a while to adjust to this new reality. I think the craziest example we saw was with the invention of the printing press, where essentially before that, everybody assumed that if it's written in a book, it must have gone through a very rigorous process, right? Very few people could write books before the printing press. It was mostly the Catholic Church or somebody who was commissioned by the Catholic Church. And then after the printing press, suddenly there were hundreds of independent publishers all over Europe. They could publish anything they want. And so some of the books that were published in that period really resulted in quite a bit of chaos. There was one book called The Hammer of Evil that essentially launched the witch hunts in Europe and ended up with 80,000 women burnt at the stake from that one book being published. There were quite a few books that launched religious wars between neighboring countries or between sets of people in the same country. If you look after the invention of the printing press, you will see something like 52 different religious wars all over Europe. And it's not that the printing press is bad. Obviously, the printing press was a great advancement for mankind. We got a lot more literate. It essentially launched the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution later on. The scientific method came a little less than 200 years after it. But this interim period after the invention is usually a transition that humans are not very good at. And bad local effects can happen during such a transition.